So I wish somebody had warned me, right? You start a company, nobody warns you. You might have baby tortoises get angry at you, and there's few things as devastating as that.
Well, I mean, as long as they're not vengeful.
I am still waiting for that.
Because what happens with a vengeful tortoise? I'm not a vengeful baby tortoise. I don't know, Kentaro. Kind of concerning.
45 years from now, when he's like 8 inches long, he's gonna like disguise himself as a rock and like trip me up somewhere. Shake his little leg at me and say, I remembered. This is ClimateTech with Kentaro, a podcast featuring the brightest minds and most influential voices in climate tech. I'm your host, Kentaro Kawamori. For the next episode in our Founder Series, that's what I'm calling our episodes with extraordinary entrepreneurs, we have one of the most innovative companies in the world. No, really. Aclima was named one of the top 100 most innovative companies by business magazine Fast Company. And its founder and CEO, Davida Herzl, was named one of the most creative entrepreneurs by the same outlet. So, now I'm sure you're all wondering, what does this amazing accolade-laden company do? Aclima operates the largest mobile sensor network on Earth, and it uses that network to track air pollution and greenhouse gases. Then, it uses software to turn its measurements into analytics so companies, governments, and communities can reduce emissions. On the show, Davida and I talked about the health impacts of pollution, the early days of our startups, and climate justice.
We're the only company in the world that can do this block by block and at the scale of entire cities, entire states now, coupled with an incredibly powerful analytics platform to help us make sense of all of those measurements, which are massive. I mean, billions and billions of measurements every month that we're generating, and really came up with the concept for Aclima over the course of, several years. There's this funny sort of projection onto founders of like eureka moments. And the truth is that ideas for companies like Aclima, and I'm sure companies like yours, are really the consequence of many years of different experiences, lived experiences that really add up to a moment of clarity and ongoing discovery as you go, right? You start with a concept, but really you get smarter about how that concept needs to exist in the world over time. And so I grew up in an entrepreneurial family, and both of my parents were entrepreneurs, both of my parents are entrepreneurs, and so measure what you manage was the mantra. And I didn't understand how we were going to meet the climate crisis without the measurement infrastructure to really understand where local emissions, not just global emissions, a lot of the historical focus has been on global emissions, but where those local emissions are coming from and who they're impacting. And so set out to solve that years ago. I actually filed the paperwork for Aclima. I incorporated Aclima in 2007, so like way back. And it didn't become my full-time focus until 2010. But there was a lot that happened in those years in between that were really important for what we ended up doing and building Kentaro. So these things are long-term journeys, right? And I'm just really excited to be where we're at right now.
It's a good reminder of that maxim that we often talk about in our world of the overnight success, many years in the making.
Right.
And I got reminded of that this morning when I was reading about Figma having their 10th anniversary. Do you all use Figma?
We do, yes.
Figma is a user interface design tool. It's quickly become the industry standard to create things like websites, apps, and even logos. I think everybody uses Figma at this point, right? And the irony was like, just a couple, 3 years ago, Figma was not the standard yet. They were growing, but they were sort of the alternative, and now they are the standard. And I was like, oh my God, Figma's been around for 10 years. I had no idea, because I've only known it for a couple of years.
Right. And I was doing other entrepreneurial things and had this idea for Aclima. We filed the corporate paperwork, but it actually didn't become my full-time focus until 2010, 2011. And we didn't hire our first employee until 2011. So about 11 years of full operation and building. But these things take a while. And sometimes the world isn't ready. The market isn't ready. The technology isn't ready. When we came up with the idea, a lot of the technologies that we needed to build Aclima just weren't really there yet. So it's all timing and also being ready for the opportunity when it becomes clear that it's the moment, right?
Exactly. I remember when you and I first chatted, you were talking about, I think it was kind of in the middle of a lot of the fundraising, and you were getting ready to do your next fundraise and talking about how different the environment was than when you first started. And you've certainly seen this a lot longer than I think most folks in the founder community in ClimateTech today, which is a good thing on both sides, right? You can pass some of that along.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's such, I think people now hear the term climate tech and they know what it means. When I moved to Silicon Valley, the clean tech bubble had just imploded a few years prior.
Sometime around 2005, the existential threat of climate change became more evident to venture capitalists, and they started heavily investing into renewable energy. Their hearts were in the right place, but due to a variety of issues, ranging from the 2008 financial crisis to cheap natural gas, investments suddenly dropped off. And now here we are, still heavily reliant on fossil fuels, but all hope is not lost. ClimateTech is back and stronger than ever. All you have to do is listen to our founder series for evidence.
In the middle of a recession, there was no capital for climate. Climate was a dirty word. Clean technology was a dirty word. And there's a number of founders that built during that era when it was a desert, frankly, at Kentaro. And in particular, during the previous administration, I mean, it was just, so tough. But the benefit of that is that it means that there are a number of companies like us that have mature solutions that are ready to get put to work at scale at a really critical moment, right, for climate action. And that we get to pass on the lessons learned from our experience to help accelerate climate solutions and climate founders at, I couldn't imagine a more important window than this window right now.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And as you said, not just infinitely more work for us to get going and just getting started in our businesses, but for the whole industry as a whole.
Absolutely.
So you're doing the business. Is it part-time? What are you doing? You said you kind of hit this milestone and then you brought on your first employee and all that sort of good stuff. So tell us a little bit about that early progression of how those early days went.
Yeah, so it's funny because I went to law school and I knew I wasn't going to practice when I was in law school. So it changes how you learn, but I knew I was going to build a company. And so I spent a lot of time really meditating on what I wanted to build. And growing up in a family of entrepreneurs, you learn that the business becomes your life and it better reflect what you care about most or it's not going to work, right? And so in the years prior, climate change was really starting to hit the broader consciousness. And so 2010, cloud computing actually started to mature. And that's when I realized, okay, now's the moment. I've got to go build. There were a few sort of critical technology milestones sort of in the ecosystem when it came to cloud that would allow us to finally really connect millions of sensors and have that data go to the cloud and be able to do computing on it at scale. And so I started engaging with investors and the community and found it incredibly difficult to convince folks to write a check. And it sounded crazy, right? I totally understand, empathize too. I'm like, you want to do what? You want to build distributed sensor networks that are generating all of this data? And what's the use case, right? And so I got it. I understood why it was hard to buy into. And it was really early too. There was a lot of really exciting work at the time happening in universities where people were starting, professors and scientists were starting to explore this idea of the quantified self and the quantified planet. And so I saw that there was this huge opportunity to do the same for air quality and greenhouse gas data. And so couldn't find investors. And so I went back to my entrepreneurial roots and said, okay, I'm just going to sell. I'm going to find customers and started knocking on doors, put together product pitches and concepts for what we thought had applicability and utility at the time. And we were able to, I teamed up with academics at UC Berkeley and we were able to get a meeting at Google. And fast forward several months from that first meeting, and we were able to sign up Google for a multi-million-dollar contract. And their deposit is really how we started building the company. And so we've been revenue positive from day one, Kentaro. It is in our DNA and is one of the reasons that I think we're able to make it through a really difficult period in the climate space when there was just very limited funding. And so we bootstrapped the company and built really hard tech via bootstrapping for that first chapter. But we got to do it with some of the most amazing customers on the planet, right? Google, we had a federal contract with the GSA. It was really kind of a magical time for us when we were able to be really heads down, and we knew we were so far ahead of like the moment. Like it was just, the market was not going to be ready yet. And we were able to go really, really deep in terms of the technology and what we were solving for, where we weren't in many ways limited by venture capital, because venture requires you to find an immediate market. We were building for customers that wanted a solution right then and there and who wanted to inform our roadmap. And that was just an incredible opportunity. I'll just, some of the best, as difficult as they were, and people often say this, some of the best years of Aclima. And our entire team looks back on those years very, very fondly now, even though they were really hard.
Yes, it's the early days are always this weird mix of stress, crazy excitement, and looking forwards, not having a whole lot to look back on yet. And then you do look back and you go, wow, there was something really special about that. And it's sort of this weird combination of the grass is always greener, but also, man, this is a really unique moment in time. So you articulated that really well.
Yeah. And we knew it. We knew it at the time. We were deploying, our first sensor network was an indoor sensor network that spanned global Google offices. And, you could, on our phone app, you could go to your phone and see, okay, what are CO2 levels in the office in Dublin, Ireland, and how does that compare to the office in Mountain View and PM 2.5 and all of these different things that we were measuring.
PM 2.5 is an air quality measurement system. If PM 2.5 levels get too high, it can be hazardous to human health.
As we were doing that, it was clear that there was something really magical about what we built that had, frankly, transformative potential at a really planetary scale. And it was magical to build something like that at that scale as your first product, Kentaro.
I definitely am envious of all the cool stuff you all got to see. Our early days were during the pandemic in a suburban house in Chandler, Arizona, where we didn't quite get to see offices as cool as Google's. We still had a hell of a good time, but definitely a very different experience.
Yeah. The pandemic challenged me. I was so used to running a company in person. And because we have hardware, a lot of our team didn't go home. We're out there deploying sensors and running networks and in the field. And so it was a particularly challenging time to adapt to that whole period. I can't imagine what it was like, Kentaro.
Well, it was a ton of really positive stuff. And one of the most exciting things was when I went out into the backyard one day and Kim, one of our co-founders, had discovered a baby desert tortoise.
Oh.
And I then got to build him or her. We never quite knew his or hers gender, but I built it a house. I fed it cabbage. And then one day it ate a piece of cabbage that was far too large for it. And I was deathly scared. This piece of cabbage was like 3 times as long as the tortoise. And he gets about, 3 inches into this thing. And keep in mind, this guy's only like 3 inches long.
Aww.
And I'm going, holy shit, he's going to choke on this piece of cabbage that I fed him. I am going to kill this baby tortoise. So then I had to pull out. He had not bitten a piece off. It's very hot in Arizona, right? He was swallowing it.
Inhaling the cabbage?
Inhaling it because it's so hot, right? That this cabbage turned into this like rubber substance. So then I pull 3 inches of cabbage out of this tortoise's mouth. Oh, no. And boy, was it pissed at me. And then 2 days later, had migrated outside of our yard. Oh, and I was extremely sad. So,
well, hey, if that's like the highlight of a day, that's pretty spectacular, Kentaro.
Well, so I wish somebody had warned me, right? You start a company, nobody warns you. You might have baby tortoises get angry at you, and there's few things as devastating as that.
Well, as long as they're not vengeful.
I am still waiting for that.
Because what happens with a vengeful tortoise? A vengeful baby tortoise. I don't know, Kentaro. Kind of concerning.
45 years from now, when he's like 8 inches long, he's going to like disguise himself as a rock and like trip me up somewhere. Shake his little leg at me and say, yeah, I remembered.
And you're in Arizona, right? So there's That's a lot of them out there.
Yeah, no, they're not. In the city, they're uncommon.
Okay.
That's why it was such a weird and special thing, because we're in the middle of the Chandler suburbs, and there's not a whole lot of baby tortoises rolling around. Plenty of scorpions, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Anyways, now that I've managed to get us down the tortoise hubble, you see what I did there? So not the rabbit hole.
That was good. That was good.
Thank you. I'm quite renowned at Persefoni for my dad jokes. And it has absolutely nothing to do with my 3-year-old. That was just always a thing for me. So great pivot point for us to talk a little bit about the tech and the solution. So you mentioned obviously deploying the sensors indoors. I was crazy excited when you first told me about the sensors that you all put into the Google Maps cars. Yep. So tell us a little bit about the actual measurement and collection component of what you do, and then kind of the broader solution into the software and data side.
Yeah. So the indoor work was where we started. We're not doing the indoor sensing anymore as a product. We still have some research initiatives that we support, but it was actually due to the indoor work that we pivoted to the outdoor work. So our original concept from the beginning, before we'd ever started engaging with Google, was deploying sensors outdoor at scale. I was really motivated by this idea of measuring greenhouse gases at the source, and then also air pollution. So one of the things we don't think about when we think about greenhouse gases or climate change is that all of the emissions that are changing the atmosphere also go into our lungs. I often joke that we're like fish in the ocean that don't know we live in water. We just lose that consciousness of the fact that we're living in this really thin layer of breathable air. And if you disrupt that layer of breathable air, you have global implications for extreme weather and the kinds of changes we're seeing today. But also the nature of the air that we're breathing fundamentally changes, right? All of those same sources of pollution for methane and greenhouse gases are also sources for things like black carbon and NO2 and toxics that go into our body and alter, human health. Air pollution is now one of the top reasons for the global health crises that we're experiencing across everything from respiratory disease to Alzheimer's and fetal development. I mean, pollution is connected to disease in every organ in the human body at every phase of life. And so when you look at sort of the status quo for how do we know what's in the air and how all of this stuff is measured, the status quo is really hasn't changed. Silicon Valley really has not touched this space. And so 50 years ago with the Clean Air Act, this sort of standardized approach to measuring air quality came into being. And that standardized approach relies on very large pieces of equipment that are the size of trailers, require an army of PhDs to run. A lot of these things aren't connected to the internet. You have to sometimes go and literally pull data off these devices with SD cards. There's some that even have floppy disks still. These things also don't all measure greenhouse gases. They're primarily focused on the criteria pollutants. And then we have no infrastructure for measuring things like methane or CO2 at the local level. And so what we thought was, okay, we've got to miniaturize this, but not just miniaturize it, but really distribute it broadly. And so what we figured out and solved for was both the equipment. So we've developed proprietary small-scale devices that measure all of those different pollutants.
Aclima's devices measure everything from methane and CO2 to PM 2.5, which I mentioned before, and they do it all over the world.
We actually first validated this approach that you could use fleets of vehicles as a roving sensor network with Google. And we instrumented Google Street View cars. We, for several years, worked with Google to kind of validate this approach. And we did some really, really groundbreaking science that has heavily impacted our space and even shown up in the most recent climate bill. We proved that pollution is hyperlocal and that sources of emissions and their impacts can vary by 800% from one block to the next. So what that means is that from one block to another, you can see differences in pollutants and pollutant concentrations that can be 800% greater from one block to the next. And so that has huge implications. One, it tells us that the traditional way that we measure air pollution just isn't enough, right? 1 or 2 stations in a city is not going to capture that hyperlocal variability, which means that it's not really going to be able to tell you if you're a city, if you're a utility, if you're an investor shaping climate action, investing in climate action, the data that exists today isn't going to tell you where to focus those dollars. If you are the federal government deploying money to reduce emissions, the traditional way of monitoring air pollution or greenhouse gases won't give you the necessary information to target those dollars. And so we worked with Google Street View to really demonstrate this capability. We started in California. We did the largest ever network here with Google. We published these really groundbreaking publications. We entered into a cooperative research and development agreement. We've published a number of major studies with the EPA directly. And that really became the foundation for where we ended up focusing all of our attention as a company, which is building these hyper-local data sets of emissions and pollution to really guide action at the local level. And now in July, we announced that the entire state of New York had adopted Aclima to generate the data and the analytics to support implementation of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is the boldest piece of climate legislation in the country and has really influenced and inspired a lot of follow-on legislation across the country, which is really changing the paradigm completely on data-driven climate action, which was the dream. It's why I started Aclima. I saw that gap, and now it's happening at the federal level through the IRA. So kind of an incredible moment for this kind of data-driven approach to climate action, an approach that also ensures that, the communities that have been hardest hit by pollution are the ones that we prioritize. And you really don't know what those communities are experiencing unless you have measurement. And so that's the critical gap that we're filling. And I'm just super proud of our team and the work that we're doing now.
It's so important, and we just don't talk about it enough, I think, these days, right? The topic and the conversation is so geared towards sort of the macro effects of climate change, but the shit is affecting human health, on a daily basis.
That is the biggest gap with climate messaging, Kentaro, right? It's like we never connected it back to people and communities and our future at that local level. And I think that was a huge mistake.
Totally agree. And I tell people in our team all the time, climate change is not going to destroy the planet.
No.
That's just not going to happen. It's going to destroy the planet as we know it, and it's going to kill species. It's going to make a hell of a lot of creatures and people suffer in the meanwhile. But I think even like the more recent conversations around climate justice, while they're important, they're still pretty broad, right? It comes down to a health and economic thing. Always hits home very closely and personally for me. My wife's family is all Vietnamese, and it's one of our places to spend time in the world. And Ho Chi Minh City, formerly Saigon, is one of my favorite cities in the world. And I have terrible asthma, and it is very difficult for me to spend extended time there because the pollution levels are so extreme.
Right. The diesel burning and all of that, it creates really horrible conditions. And you sometimes, we talk about asthma, right, as an impact, but we don't often talk about the fact that those same particles that irritate your lungs and your esophagus and have all of these impacts on, those short-term respiratory impacts, they also cross the blood-brain barrier. They also cause things like Alzheimer's. They also cause things like strokes, and they get into the womb and impact the development of fetuses. Like, we just haven't talked enough about this in the climate community. And one of the reasons that I started Aclima, so I grew up in San Diego and spent a lot of time, my father was very involved before Alibaba, there was this whole world of people that engaged in import and export at a time of expanding globalization. And when you see sort of factories on the other side of the border and you see the impacts that those local emissions have across the border on communities, we don't often consider that living our lives of convenience actually sacrifices entire communities of people. If you go to places like the petrochemical corridor in Louisiana, locally they refer to it as Cancer Alley because you have some of the highest rates of cancer in the world impacting those communities that are on the front line, experiencing those levels of pollution, breathing in those toxics, breathing in that air. And many times, and this has always been something I've really struggled with in Silicon Valley, is we treat them as invisible. In the same way that pollution is invisible, those impacts are often invisible to us. And so part of my mission in starting Aclima was to make that visible, to make those connections visible. And so, in the United States, I don't know if you've ever heard of the practice of redlining.
Redlining was an extremely discriminatory practice where mortgage brokers literally drew red lines around predominantly Black and brown communities and refused to lend them money. Its after effects are still really obvious all around the United States today.
And so what happened is that all of those parts of our country became where we put traffic corridors. It became where we put factories. It became where we put all of those sources of emissions. And it's why if you're Black in the United States, you're, 3 times more likely to die as a result of disease induced by pollution. That is also a local impact, an impact of the root cause of climate change. And so we're just not making enough of those connections to those human impacts that aren't just far off on the other side of the planet. They're happening right here in our own backyard.
No doubt about it. And, I do think it's changing slowly, certainly not fast enough. But the interesting thing for me was, I was thinking about all of you when I was in Tokyo over the summer, and the government has required every taxi to put an air quality meter inside of the taxis. I don't know if you've seen that.
I have. It's so cool.
It is, right? And that was really on the back of COVID. They were doing it so that people could see the air was clean. But they sort of created the second order effect of, hey, you now have thousands of air quality measurements just rolling around the city, which was super cool.
No, it's super cool. And indoor air quality is a huge problem because when you're in an enclosed space and there is outdoor pollution coming in, it actually concentrates, and levels of indoor pollution can be much higher than outdoor pollution because it gets trapped. And so, yes, the impetus was COVID, but I think there will be some really long-term implications around growing awareness around how important that is. And when you look at what's so powerful about what's happened and what's happening nationally with the IRA and the climate bill is that there's requirements for 40% of the benefits of climate action to go towards communities that are hardest hit by pollution, these historically redlined communities. And so even if as a climate tech community, I think the conversation is growing, it's going to become critical to pay attention to. In New York, that is the requirement. 40% of the money that is being deployed into climate action actually has to benefit and directly be invested in the communities that have historically been hardest hit by emissions, by pollution. And it cuts across both air pollution and greenhouse gases. I mean, the methane data that we're generating in New York right now is, spectacular in terms of what it's showing us and what it's helping us understand about all of those local levels of greenhouse gases too.
No doubt. And while we're making progress, I think sadly we're regressing in many other places, right? I mean, even here in the state of Arizona, our attorney general is fighting BlackRock on its ESG funds. The state of Florida just banned its pensions from investing in anything labeled as climate or ESG. And sadly, that's where it's going to be worst, right? Because that's where a lot of those marginalized communities are most prevalent, is in Republican states, and New York is a standout, sadly, in New York and California, and we're just not seeing that happening in other places. Okay, we've made it through Aclima's tech, why it's important, and how our country needs to change in the future to create more just communities. So now seems like as good a time as any to learn a bit more about Davida. That's right, Climate Techies, the rapid fire round. So, rapid fire question number 1. What advice do you have for the next generation of aspiring entrepreneurs that want to get into climate tech?
Oh, there's so much. So it's hard to do rapid fire on this.
Calling these rapid fire is just an inside joke at this point.
I think climate is such a particularly challenging space because I think as entrepreneurs, we're inherently optimistic, right, about what we can do and achieve. It's why we take on these crazy ideas and crazy adventures in building. But I think that as an entrepreneur in the climate space, you have to take extra effort and pay extra attention to your state of mind, the kinds of people and culture that you build at your companies. I think Aclima shows that, and because of the state of the climate crisis, these are long-term journeys, building solutions that have never been built before. And really mind your culture, really mind the values that you are building with, because that is going to determine who joins you on the journey. I'm gifted with one of the most spectacular teams I could have possibly imagined. I mean, I have people that have been with me from day one. These are long tenures. These are problems, if the problems are worth solving, they're going to be hard. And so I think spending a lot of time really reflecting on what those values are that you want to live up to are going to determine the people that come alongside you on every dimension, your investors, your team members, your advisors, even your customers. And so I think it's really important to pay a lot of attention to that. And sometimes it can be easy to, ignore that. And especially when there's money flowing, right? We just, as a sector, we don't want to repeat the mistakes of others that have built in the technology community. We want to do it with this is not only an opportunity to build incredible solutions that fix the world, but also companies that set a new standard for how companies behave in society.
Love it. That's a vision shared by our joint investor, Clear Vision, right? Is that whole thesis around category creating companies and standards setting companies. So I think that's a great example there.
Yep.
All right. Question number 2. What is your favorite place to travel to or vacation in?
Anything that involves hiking through mountains and no Wi-Fi signal. My friend works in satellites, and they just launched yesterday with SpaceX a global connectivity program where you can't get away from connectivity, which is an incredible solution for emergency and really world changing. But I really love getting out into nature and really reconnecting, disconnecting. We happen to be here in the Bay Area, and I love crossing that bridge and going into the redwoods. And so it's not maybe so much a vacation, but the opportunity to really connect with the things that inspire and connect us to purpose. And so I love getting out there.
It's always interesting when I hear folks talk about that, because I love turning off my phone into airplane mode, do not disturb, whatever it may be. And I actually have no problem doing that whenever I please. But getting into nature for me is about getting away from people, not necessarily connectivity.
Right.
What does that say about you?
Right. Well, I'm like a total introvert, in so many ways. What I'm doing at Aclima is like not my natural sort of inclination. Like I just love time alone and time with like people that I really care about, and getting out there and connecting with the things that matter. And then those are the things that motivate me to do crazy things that we do every day when you are on all the time. But as on as I am all the time, it's pretty easy to turn off.
Totally. I don't think people realize how many founders that appear extroverted are actually quite introverted by nature. We're just very practiced at doing that opposite thing.
Yeah.
It's the same for me. I'm never more at home when I'm in front of my gaming computer with a can of Pringles and my 2-liter of Mountain Dew and just in my own world.
Totally. I always joke, I got an F in public speaking in high school. It was my only F. And I made up for it with like extra, I did like a bunch of extra credit to get to a good grade, but it is just not my thing, right? And I had to really get practiced at it. And now, I do public speaking every day, all the time, but it's just such a funny paradox for, I think, a lot of us, Kentaro.
That is brutal. What?
Isn't it?
What kind of teacher gives you an F? Like that should be at least a D for trying.
I know. Well, I ended up doing okay. I got a B at the end of the day. But you'd get those in junior high school or high school, you get the interim sort of progress reports. And I got one of those and I was like, oh, damn it. I am going to have to do like the debate club. And so then I practiced, did really well, but it was just, but he gave me enough because I was not volunteering to do it. And so he made sure that I knew that wasn't what I was supposed to be doing in a public speaking class.
That's cold. What a hater. All right, let's see. Next one. This is much better introvert question. 3 of your favorite books of all time.
Oh my God. This is not going to be a rapid fire.
I can give you an example of how to do that really, really eloquently and sophisticatedly.
Go ahead.
Cat in the Hat, Harry Potter, Order of the Phoenix, Harry Potter, The Half-Blood Prince.
There you go. Growing up, I loved Shel Silverstein. I read all of those books and they just had a big influence. One of them was The Giving Tree. Did you ever read that one?
I did. That's a great one. Yeah,
that's a great one. So I love The Giving Tree. There is a business book that I really love that influenced how I think about climate tech. And it was written a long time ago, but Blue Ocean Strategy, about how you shape business strategy in blue ocean markets. And I go back to it a lot. Just, when things get hard, it's important to remember that climate tech entrepreneurs were building in markets that haven't existed before. And so there's a lot of wisdom around how you build venture capital funded companies in spaces where there's a lot of players and you're disrupting those existing players. There's not a lot of wisdom out there on how you build companies in spaces where you're having to define the market. And so Blue Ocean Markets is a really great one. And then the other one, I've read a lot, which is maybe a little bit sort of, I don't know how many people have said this to you, but Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. It was a big, and it was important for me. And so those are my three that I can, there's a lot. So it feels unfair to name only 3, but those are 3 of the ones that come to mind kind of immediately.
Well, that's the hard part. That's why so few rapid fire rounds are rapid.
Yeah.
But good answer. All right, last one. What is your superpower?
My superpower is resilience and grit and sort of will. I'm very strong-willed. And I think my superpower is the ability to not give up when everybody else will. And that has served me well in building Aclima, but also in life. There's a lot of life that happens in the background when you're building companies, and it can be really challenging. And so I'm grateful for that superpower, because I don't think we would be here without it. And it's a lot. It's a lot to build something that hasn't existed before, and at the same time have a lot of life happening in the background. And so I think in particular for, I've talked to a lot of founders who've been building during the pandemic, and it has really become a very sort of critical capability. But I'm really proud of the ability to have done that and to push through, and I'm glad we did.
I love that answer. You are a Teflon Don for sure. Nothing can phase you, and you just can push through the sticky stuff. Love it.
Yeah.
Well, this has been an excellent one. Thanks a bunch for coming on. Learned a ton, as is always the most important thing. And hopefully I didn't waste too much of your time with my tortoise stories. But
no, it was awesome. And really, thank you for the opportunity, Kentaro, to share our story, and wonderful to really talk to you. And I feel really honored to be in the group of all the incredible people you've been interviewing. I've been listening to them, and it's just, they've all been really incredible interviews. So thank you.
make sure to check out Davida Herzl and her work at Aclima. Links are in our show notes as always. Before we go, please don't forget to subscribe to ClimateTech with Kentaro on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you listen on. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back with another fantastic episode soon. Catch you all then. ClimateTech with Kentaro is produced by our incredible team at Persefoni and Hueman Group Media. Our theme music is by Guest House. And if you want to learn more about Persefoni and our climate management and accounting platform, please visit our website at persefoni.com.